Good evening. Welcome to our November Lyceum series, Education seminar for tonight. We are proud to welcome as our guest Matthew Zamaskey. Right Worshipful Matt Szramoski is Grand Senior Deacon for the Grand Lodge of Virginia, and if elected, would be Grand Master in 2025. Matt holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from Christopher Newport University, Associate of Science in Public Administration. He has been a high school social studies teacher, worked for the Williamsburg Daily Press, managed youth programs for the NRA, and is currently Director of Development for the Supreme Council of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite at the House of the Temple since 2007. He is a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and boy, he's got a long pedigree of appended bodies, past High Priest, past Commander, past District Deputy Grand Commander, past Worthy Patron, DeMolay Advisor, Associate Garden of Job's Daughters, and is a member of Knight Masons, York Rite College, Red Cross of Constantine, and the Royal Order of Scotland, among others. And again, as I say, he is Grand Senior Deacon for the Grand Lodge of Virginia, and he is here tonight to talk about 243 years of the Grand Lodge of Virginia, which holds among its members President George Washington, President William McKinley, and Supreme Court Justice John Jay. Matt, thank you for joining us tonight, and the show is yours.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And brethren, good evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and try to give you, over the next 25 minutes to 30 minutes, a history of the Grand Lodge of Virginia from our beginning up to the present time. And I will pull this up now, if you'll bear with me for 1 second here. Okay. Again, greetings from the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I want to talk to you first a little bit about how Freemasonry started in Virginia. And I always like to throw this little quote up here, Virginians, we take a lot of pride. We were the first permanent English settlement in the New World in 1607 in Jamestown. So we're very proud of our heritage and where we come from, whether you're a Virginian by birth or adoption. And tonight we'll symbolically adopt all of you as Virginians as we talk about the history of the Grand Lodge of Virginia. If you go back to the beginning, we have records in Virginia that date back to the 1720s. We don't know how early Freemasonry actually started in Virginia. The reason we don't, the earliest records, the three lodges that were meeting at that point were already well established. Two of them had had a fire earlier and the records were destroyed. So, did they begin in the 1710, 1705 before the Grand Lodge of England was even formed? We don't know, but definitely by the 1720s, we have records from Norfolk, Gloucester, and an area called Bowling Green that Freemasonry was in existence, and those records are still there. And two of those three lodges are still active in Virginia. Our first lodge was in Norfolk number 1. And it's kind of interesting if you look at where the lodges were chartered and where they came from. Obviously, being a colony of England, the lodges that came here came from England, Scotland, Ireland. And the Scottish ones were often started by sailors, folks on ships. There were a lot of businessmen that came from Scotland that did trade back and forth, and they brought their lodges with them, where the ones started by English tend to be settlers, as well as the one or two that were started by lodges from Ireland, originally the Grand Lodge of Ireland. And they were established, not surprisingly, if you were to step back in time to Virginia in the early 1700s, most of the major towns and cities were along either rivers or the Chesapeake Bay. And that made sense because the primary mode of transportation back then for trade, whether it was tobacco or timber going to England or manufactured goods coming into Virginia, would have been through those port towns. And that's where the population was at. Around 1750, about 80% of the population lived within 20 miles of some body of water. If you were to go inland to what is now central and the western part of Virginia, it would have been extremely rural, very, very small population. We got the southwestern part. We have some counties that weren't even settled till just shortly before the Revolution. So pretty much along the eastern, if you looked at the east coast of Virginia, go north and south, is where you would see the lodges early on. It's interesting to note that the Virginia had a royal governor up till the Revolution, and the last royal governor was also a Freemason, John Murray, and he remained in Virginia until about 2 years in the Revolution. He led a British contingent attempting to capture Norfolk and was very soundly defeated. He fled by boat, never to return to Virginia. So how did the Grand Lodge start? We take a lot of pride in saying we're the oldest continuous Grand Lodge in America. Now, our brethren up in Massachusetts sometimes like to argue they're a little bit older, but in Massachusetts, they actually merged 2 Grand Lodges together in the late 1700s. Ours was an independent single Grand Lodge since 1778 and has continued since that time. And how, I'll tell you a little bit about how that all came about and how it evolved. Of course, the American Revolution started. We were about a year into the war, and a letter went out from one of the master actually in Williamsburg Lodge, to the existing lodges in Virginia at that time. And there were 12 that he sent a letter to asking to have a meeting to discuss the formation of a Grand Lodge. 3 did not respond, but 9 did. And I listed the ones here. And for those of you who are not familiar with Virginia's geography, again, all these, with the exception of Petersburg, are port towns. And Petersburg is off a river, a little bit inland, but not too far. And it was a major tobacco trading town. St. Tammy is one of our older lodges in Hampton. I'm going to tell you a little more about them later, some unique history there. But 9 lodges did agree to meet, and 3 did not. And then what they did was they got together in Williamsburg in 1777 to discuss the potential to form a new Grand Lodge. Now, there's always a lot of interest and rumors about George Washington. He was nominated to be the first Grand Master, but as you can guess, he was a little busy at the time with the American Revolution and was not able to fill that role. So they nominated 2 other men and finally settled on John Blair. John was an attorney out of Williamsburg Lodge, a very distinguished Master Mason, and he served the first full term as Grand Master of Masons in Virginia during the Revolutionary War. Interesting, our Grand Master's jewel, which is worn to this day, was designed by Paul Revere. It's made out of solid gold. And today, the Grand Master only wears it twice. He wears it as installation of officers, and he wears it for his official portrait. Otherwise, he wears a replica one, and that original jewel is kept locked in a safe. But a really beautiful, unique item that has been in existence has been worn by every Grand Master since John Blair. Now, I'm going to try to break up the history of the Grand Lodge into about 4 or 5 periods, starting with Colonial Virginia, obviously. And before you is a portrait of George Washington, which you may not know, hopefully some of you have seen this before. That is a oil painting that was done of him, or excuse me, a pastel painting while he was alive. And it is the only Masonic painting done while he was living. And if you could see that in its full size, it's also one of the only paintings where Washington allowed them to paint him as he actually looked. He has scars on his face when he had smallpox, and you can see some other injuries and so forth. And a really prominent painting. The original is on display at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, and we have a replica one at the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. And let's talk about our founding father, George Washington, a little bit about his Masonic history and where he came from. Washington originally was raised in Fredericksburg Lodge. He grew up on a plantation known as Ferry Farm, located not too far from Fredericksburg. It's about 5 miles from the city. So it was only natural that he'd be raised there. Most people think George was at Mount Vernon for his whole life, and he wasn't. He actually purchased it from a relative later in life, before the Revolution, but when he was well into his 30s. And after he had married Martha, who was a very wealthy widow, Martha, her husband had died very young when he was in his late 20s, and she had already had her children when she married George. And she was actually worth about 4 or 5 times what Washington was. So her funds went to the purchase of Mount Vernon. And then at Fredericksburg Lodge, they do have a museum on their upper floor for Washington. They do have the original Bible still that Washington took his Masonic obligations on. Now, he would move to Mount Vernon later on, shortly after the French and Indian War, and he would serve several years after the Revolution and after founding the Republic as the master of what was then just called Alexandria Lodge number 22 in 1788, 1789. Now, that lodge today is known as Alexandria Washington Lodge number 22. And if you ever go to the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, it's one of the two lodges that meet in that building. Now, that the memorial was created, and we'll talk more about this later. Mcarthur, when Washington died, left many of his possessions to the lodge. And these became the basis and the reason for the whole George Washington Masonic National Memorial being created. And we'll discuss that a little bit later, but two items I want to mention to you are kind of interesting that are on display there at the museum. One is what some people call the death clock. When Washington died, his doctor, who was a master mason, he had a clock by his bed, and the doctor reached into the clock at the moment of his death and cut the wire so that it would never advance another minute past the death of George Washington. And that clock is on display in the museum. And I find that to really be an interesting item when you think about that. It was right there. Washington saw it every day. And the fact it was stopped right at that moment when his life came to an end. Also in the museum is the chair from his study, which was Washington's most popular room. If you ever visit Mount Vernon, it's where he had his books, his library collection. He did most of his writing from there. And Washington was a prolific writer. So it's really interesting to have both those artifacts there. And every Grand Master of Virginia, when they're in office, is invited to come to the museum, and they take a picture of the Grand Master sitting in Washington's chair. So neat little artifact. I want to share with you, I picked just a few. There were so many to choose from the colonial period. I just picked a few men to highlight, to share a little bit of information on them, to tell you a little bit about what they did. One is Lighthorse Harry Lee. He got that nickname Lighthorse because he was a cavalry leader in the American Revolution, and really probably Washington's closest confidant. Harry Lee was, of course, the father of Robert E. Lee, later to become general, famous from the war between the states. He became the 9th governor of Virginia, also served in the House of Representatives, and he's the one that made the very famous quote that almost every other school child has heard about Washington being the first in war, first in peace, and so forth. Very, very close to Washington. Really good man. Unfortunately, Lee in his later years developed a drinking problem and essentially bankrupted the family. When Robert E. Lee was a young boy, he had to go off and live with relatives up in Alexandria because the father lost the estate and all the property they had when he was a boy. So kind of a big downfall for such a prominent leader from the Revolution, but a very active Master Mason. Peyton Randolph is another one I picked. This name may not be quite as familiar to you, but Peyton was a really important figure in the founding of our country. He went on to serve as the governor of Virginia as well. Interesting, he was the first U.S. Attorney General, was appointed to that office under Washington, also as a delegate to the Continental Congress, and active Mason who went on to serve as Grand Master. John Marshall's another prominent jurist. He went on to be the 4th Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was an officer during the war, and a lot of folks don't know that Marshall played an active role in the ratification of his Constitution. Not only did he do that in Virginia, where he went around and talked to delegates, he also traveled to about a half dozen of the colonies to promote the ratification and help when it looked really difficult and it might not happen. He also, a lot of people don't know that after the Revolutionary War, we actually had some conflict with France on the high seas that actually ended up in several actions between our ships and theirs. And he brokered a treaty with our old ally and brought us back together again following the Revolutionary War. And he also went on to serve as Grand Master of Masonry. So some really, prominent men. I probably could have given you 100, but some really key figures in the founding of our country, in our early government. There are some myths. I'll just show you real quickly. Thomas Jefferson was not a Mason. That has been a myth for years. And the reason for it, we don't know why. When Jefferson was buried, there were Masons attired in aprons and ornament who participated in his funeral march. And we don't know why they did that, if they just did it because they thought he was a great guy, great leader. But there's no record of him being a Master Mason, nor Patrick Henry. So those two are often, you'll see things in the internet claiming they were Masons. We have no records whatsoever that either one was a member. One thing I want to highlight to you, this photo doesn't do it justice. This is Mason's Hall, and it's the oldest building that was constructed for Masonic purposes in the United States. It opened in 1787. It just went through a major renovation. The whole outside's been repainted. The shutters have been redone. They did quite a bit of work to it. But it's a really fascinating building. It's in Richmond, Virginia, located downtown. And one of the few buildings that survived the Civil War. Richmond, when the South was evacuated and there had been a siege there during the war, which we'll talk about in just a bit, the city was burned, and the argument has always been, was it Southerners leaving that were trying to burn weapons and supplies, or is it Northern troops coming? Nobody really knows. But Grant, when he was coming in, assigned troops to guard certain areas. And Mason's Hall, there was a colonel in the Union Army who recognizes the Masonic building and actually placed troops around to protect it, and it survived the fire and looting. But a wonderful place to visit if you're ever in Richmond. I highly encourage you to take a look at the oldest building constructed for Masonic purposes. If you went to the other lodges in Virginia from the 1700s or anywhere else in the US, they generally met at taverns or some other kind of building that they rented. But this was actually constructed solely to serve as a Masonic temple. So let's talk a little bit about, we've gotten through the Revolution. America's an independent country now. And what happened with Freemasonry in Virginia as the nation began to grow. If you were to look at, I know Micah is a map collector, if you were to look at a map of Virginia back in the 1700s, you would see that it included huge parts of what are now Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, even a little bit of Illinois were part of Virginia. And right after the Revolution, those were very quickly separated, most of those areas, and were incorporated into various territories and later on became states. But we had lodges chartered in what would eventually become 5 other states, including West Virginia, which of course separated during the Civil War. James Monroe, we mentioned earlier, was a Virginia Mason. Monroe was a very active Mason. We actually have records in Virginia of him at about 60 different state communications at various lodges in Virginia, and several writings that he did. It's nice to know that Monroe's birthplace today, the executive director of that, is a Virginia Master Mason. So one of our good brethren is looking after his homestead. A lot of lodges suffered damage during the War of 1812 when we were fighting Britain, about 30 some odd years after the American Revolution. They went up, there was a major invasion, if you've never studied that war, and it's kind of an obscure one to most Americans who study history, up the Chesapeake, which is when they burned, of course, the Capitol, and raided all the towns along the way. So a lot of our lodges that were on the coast, which is where the majority are at, had a lot of damage. St. Tammy Lodge in Hampton has kind of an interesting story. I threw it in here, it could have been later in the Civil War. St. Tammany has a unique story I don't think any other lodge in the country has. Their lodge is right on the water. It's about 2 miles from the port. And so it was very quickly, if any conquering army was coming in, it wouldn't take long for them to confiscate or anything in the building. And the lodge officer jewels were captured in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and the Civil War by the enemy. And in all 3 cases, those jewels were returned to the lodge after the conflict. So it's a really incredible piece of history that, and they're sterling silver, they're a beautiful set of jewels, were captured 3 times and actually were stolen. And in each case, a Master Mason, who was usually an officer, I believe was an officer in all 3 cases, found out about it. He made sure they were returned to the lodge in all 3 cases shortly after the conflict. So kind of an interesting bit of historic trivia there. Another thing that happened during this period was the rise of the anti-Masonic party. If you're not familiar with that, we don't have a lot of time, I'll mention it real quickly. This was the first time we had a third party in America. And it was created, there was a movement, there was a group of individuals that were very misled, who felt that Masonry, much like some of our detractors today, almost that we were like a cult and that we were trying to control the government because of the number of prominent Masons who had served either as president or in the Supreme Court or in the House and Senate. It really hurt Masonry. And this also came out, of course, after there's a famous death in New York we won't have time to get into now, of a man who was supposedly had revealed Masonic secrets. And it gets very complicated, but there was a very strong rise in the popular news of the day against Masonry, and Freemasonry Masonic membership really dropped in the United States, and particularly in the Northeast. If you went up to Maine and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, some of those states lost 3/4 of their membership. And in 1843, a convention was held in Baltimore, Maryland, to try to resolve some of the issues that came out of this movement. And John Dove, who was a Virginia Master Mason, was elected as the president of the convention. And that was when they decided how we would recognize Masons from the jurisdictions. It eventually led to us like having dues cards. They didn't have those prior to that. What would be the correct modes of recognition that you could ask when a man came to visit a lodge? And also to clean up some issues in ritual, which we all know that each of our jurisdictions has little changes here and there, but they tried to clean up some of the things they thought had gotten into it that did not belong there. But that was a really, really important meeting and pretty much established Freemasonry the way it exists today. So you get a few years past that time period and we get into the war between the states, or the Civil War. And again, just tremendous numbers of Virginians who were Master Masons, but I thought I just would discuss a few with you. At the Battle of Gettysburg, I thought was really significant. We all know about the famous Pickett's charge on the third day of the battle when they went across the field, and the Union troops just obliterated them. It was a really bad move. The North had Big Round Top and Little Round Top, which were two rock outcrops, and then troops in between with lots of artillery, and they just wiped out the Confederate troops that were moving forward. Lee had been injured and was sick from a couple days before, and a lot of people think because of his not feeling well, he was not making his decisions as good as possible. And the fact that Stewart, who was his cavalry leader, had been off, for lack of a better word, riding around, and had not gotten him all the intelligence he needed in a timely manner. So he kind of had to fight the battle where he was at. But at Pickett's charge, of course, Pickett, the general of the division that led the attack, was a Master Mason. And Lewis Armistead, some of you may know if you watch the movie Gettysburg, he is the Confederate general that died right at the Union lines and asked for his information to be given to General Hancock, who was a friend of his, who was also a Mason. And there's now a monument at the Gettysburg battlefield, friend to friend. Some of you may have seen that, which was created in his honor. James Kemper was one of the other corps commanders there. He also was a Virginia Mason, later on to be Grand Master and Governor of Virginia. So a lot of prominent Masons just at that one battle. It's interesting to note that Winfield Scott, who was the commander of Union troops right at the beginning of the war, was also a Virginia Mason. He was a member of a lodge down in Petersburg. One of the stories I always find fascinating is we believe that we have the only Grand Master who ever died in action. Our Grand Master during the war, William Harmon, he was a cavalry officer. He died in a battle at Waynesboro, Virginia. That was a supply depot. It's located in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and he was shot 3 times and died on the spot, and received Masonic rites about 2 days later. And as far as we know, the only Grand Master who's died in combat while serving. An interesting story is what happened at Winchester Hiram Lodge number 21. Now, Winchester, if you look at a map of Virginia, it's located in the very top portion. There's like a point at the top of Virginia. Kind of looks like a pyramid up there. And Winchester was there. It also holds a record for having changed sides the most in the war. I think about 18 times, either the North or the South controlled, and went back and forth, back and forth. Well, the lodge, it's kind of funny, really, figured out this could be a moneymaker for them. What they did was they performed courtesy work for lodges, both from the North and South, depending on who occupied it. And they raised over 300 Master Masons during the war in this period, and made a lot of money from it. They charged a fee for everybody they did it for. And I'm going to show you in a second how that benefited the lodge. Was a significant number of men, including a man who would become President McKinley down the road. He was from Ohio, but his military unit was occupying Winchester, and he was raised there at the lodge during the war. Shortly after it also, a Confederate Captain A.G. Babcock donated land, which became the Masonic Home of Virginia for orphans. And that opened about 3 years after the completion of the war. Now, I mentioned about Winchester Highland Lodge, how they made all this money from all these candidates during the war. Here's what they did with it. They have a beautiful lodge. They hired artists to come in and paint these beautiful murals all the way around the room, do the wonderful detail work on the ceiling. And if you could go to the lodge, this photo doesn't do it justice. The paintings are done so well that when you walk by them, a lot of them, it looks like the eyes are following you. It's really, really just incredible artwork. And this was all paid for from the money from those fees during the war between the states. So pretty wise use on their part of the money, and kept the lodge from getting pillaged or anything. They practiced true brotherly love and affection with the brethren, whether they're from the north or south. And to the best of our knowledge, there was never any dissension or arguments or problems with both the Confederate and Union troops coming through there at different periods and being involved with the lodge. So fascinating story there. So we get through the war between the states, we go through Reconstruction, and things start getting better. The country is growing again. The South is coming back. During this period, the Grand Lodge of Virginia became very active, laying cornerstones. In some years, there were over 100 laid all over. Some of the prominent ones I listed is a few here, like the Yorktown Victory Monument, if you ever go to the Yorktown Battlefield, beautiful monument. The Lee statue, which unfortunately is no longer up in Richmond, and a lot of, probably about 40%, 50% of the university buildings in Virginia were had cornerstones laid between 1870 and about 1910, 1915. A lot of Virginia Masons were active in politics during this period, and about a little bit over half of our governors up to 1900 were Master Masons. One thing our Committee on Work did this time was, after the war, they found out that the ritual had gotten very sloppy in a lot of places. So we established a formal Committee on Work, and they were tasked with going all over Virginia, making sure the work was correct. And interestingly, West Virginia, which, if you'll recall, had broken off from Virginia during the Civil War, our Committee on Work went to West Virginia and helped them establish their ritual and their Grand Lodge. So that was all done peacefully. And again, another good example of Freemasonry in action. Our district deputy Grand Master system was created, and it eventually expanded to 57 districts in Virginia. And a neat thing in industry, Newport News Shipyard opens in the late 1800s. It's now the largest shipyard in the world. That's where they make all the aircraft carriers at, about half the submarines, and they made many, many other ships there. The first CEO, once they got up and running about 7 years into it, when it became a major shipyard, was Homer Ferguson, who was a member of Brahman Lodge and Newport News. And a really impressive shipyard if you were down the southeastern part of the state. And in Virginia, I always tell folks, you know, a lot of people look at statistics and they say, gosh, Masonry was at its best in the 50s or maybe the 60s when they look at the membership numbers. And I would argue that's really not the case. If you look back in the 20s, and most Grand Lodges, including ours, if you look for percentage of the population, not the raw numbers, but the percentage, it was at its highest in most Grand Lodges in the 20s. And Freemasonry was really, really doing well. And World War I, though, slowed that down a little bit, the growth. And then later, of course, the Depression, which had a tremendous effect on membership. I did include a photo here. This is an image of laying the cornerstone at the Yorktown Monument. Probably most of you have never been there, but if you went to it, it has a series of steps, about 6 that come up each side of the monument. So what they did was, I guess they didn't want anybody to fall, and it wasn't really conducive to people standing around. They built this massive wooden platform actually above the base of the monument. And then they lowered the cornerstone into it. And that's what they're doing here. And there's you can see Knights Templar in the background, as well as many Master Masons. The president was there at the time. I think it was Harding. And really pretty impressive ceremony, kind of a neat photo. And you can see some ships in the back on the York River. This monument's a really, really beautiful memorial. It's an obelisk. It's about, I guess, gosh, 90 feet tall, maybe 100, and worth seeing if you're ever down in Yorktown, looking at the battlefields or Colonial Williamsburg. So we get into the Depression. Masonic membership in Virginia plummeted by 68% during the Depression. Huge decline. And it's obvious the reason why. And the same thing happened in most Grand Lodges. Many folks were out of jobs, or if they did have them, they were making less. And you just got to the point where, hey, you got to feed the family or pay my dues. So we had a tremendous decline in membership. Harry Byrd, not to be confused with Byrd of West Virginia, although they were related, was elected to office. And Byrd ran Virginia politics for 4 decades. It was called the Byrd Machine. And from the 30s until about the late 60s, early 70s, you did not run for office in Virginia unless you were endorsed by Harry Byrd. Very, very active individual in politics and a Master Mason in Virginia. Mentioned earlier, we talked about the George Washington Masonic National Memorial. The construction started on that in 1922. The reason the memorial was built, Alexandria Washington Lodge, which had possession of all those artifacts of George Washington, they had a serious fire in their lodge, which was in downtown Alexandria, Old Town it's called today. And they lost about 40% of their Washington artifacts, pretty significant amount. And one of their masters, who was a past Grand Master, started an effort nationally to raise money saying, one, Washington is our preeminent Master Mason for the whole country. We should recognize him and educate future generations about him. And secondly, we should preserve all these artifacts of Washington and construct, at that time, what they called a fireproof building to preserve them. So that was the evolution of what caused that effort to build the memorial. Of course, the war starts, and that brings challenges because Masonry was already on the decline during the Depression. Now all these men are going overseas to fight. What's going to happen? And the same thing happened in World War II in Virginia that happened in the Civil War. And I'll use Yorktown Lodge as an example. Yorktown Lodge is located about halfway between Williamsburg and Newport News. But more importantly, it's located next to, adjacent to several military complexes. The Coast Guard Reserve Officer Training School is located about 2 miles from the lodge. There's Yorktown Naval Weapons Station, which is where they keep all the ammunition and weapons for the Navy down at Norfolk Navy Base, which is the largest in the world. There's another facility called Chimax. There's 2 or 3 other ones that are all within about a 8-mile radius. Yorktown Lodge during World War II raised over 400 Master Masons. About 98% were courtesy work. And they had so much degree work, they did it 5 nights a week. They had 5 degree teams they set up. And if you were, for example, on the Tuesday degree team, you did degree work every Tuesday for about 3 years. And they, like I said, established 5 teams, worked Monday through Friday, and that lasted for about 34 months. They did that. So pretty incredible when you think about it. I wonder how many today would give up that much of their time to make that investment in their fellow brethren. Pretty interesting facts. I put one of our past Grand Masters in Weber. I think what he did was really interesting. Weber lived in Old Town Alexandria, probably about 6 miles south of Washington, D.C., across the Potomac from the nation's capital. And Weber had done fairly well in life. He was a businessman, had a very nice home in Old Town. And he actually opened his house up. He had 2 daughters. He moved them upstairs with him and his wife. They all lived and they moved their kitchen up there. And the whole lower floor of their house, they turned into kind of like, if you think about like a USO facility, they had food available, pool tables, a radio. And his house, he kept open for the duration of the war for 4 years for servicemen that were serving at the Pentagon and other facilities, Fort Myer, that weren't too far from where he lived. And they could come there and just have a place to relax, get away from their duties. And many of the young ladies that were friends of his daughters served as hostesses. And it was just a really incredible thing. And they estimate that Weber provided about $5,000 of his own money just for the purchase of refreshments during that period. When you think about inflation, how much that is, that's a significant amount of money. But again, just an example of Freemasonry in action and helping others. One other thing I wanted to note from World War II, Douglas Mcarthur, who, of course, he became Master Mason in the Philippines. Later in life, he lived in Virginia for a while, and they agreed that he would donate all of his papers and items to a new museum in Norfolk, where he and his wife will both be buried. And they are there now. They're interred there, and there's a wonderful museum in downtown Norfolk. And the Grand Lodge Virginia actually does a wreath laying and memorial ceremony every year for MacArthur at the memorial. And it's really well attended. We had about 140 Master Masons there this year for the event. Pretty good turnout. So let's talk now. We got through World War II. We'll talk a little bit more about Virginia Masonry and the modern times and kind of where we're at today. We reached our height of membership in 1971 with 78,000 members. We started establishing our youth groups. They came around right before the Depression in the early 20s for Dean Lane Joe's Daughters, but the Rainbow Girls not until much later, 1977. Some of our prominent Master Masons from recent years, Eric Cantor, who is the House Majority Leader, not too long ago is an active Virginia Mason. Our most recent governor was back in 2002. He went out, Jim Gilmore. Now he's a terrorist expert, goes around talking about terrorism. And currently, we have a pretty good number of folks who are serving in elective offices. Our highest one right now is our Attorney General, which for Virginia is the highest legal office in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And he's a past master, actually. And currently, our membership is 32,000. And of course, most of you probably know that our new Grand Commander, Jim Cole, is a past Grand Master Masons Virginia. We're very proud of him on his election and selection as Grand Commander just 2 years ago. So where are we going in the future in Virginia? One thing we've done is we've developed a strategic planning committee, which has all the Grand Line, the Grand Secretary, and the Grand Treasurer, and they meet monthly. And we develop a unified plan for the next 5 to 10 years. In Virginia, it used to be like in many jurisdictions where the Grand Master would have his year. And he'd say, here's what I'm going to do during my year. We no longer do that in Virginia. We actually do long-term plans. Now, certainly the Grand Master has his own theme and he might promote a certain charity a little more. But as far as the activities of the Grand Lodge, our plan, our goals, that is all done over a 5 and 10-year plan with input from all the Grand Line officers as well as others. We, Virginia, of course, we still do not permit solicitation for membership, but we do allow bring a friend programs, which are essentially an open house where you can invite non-Masons to come out, talk about the fraternityism, it's all over. You can tell them, hey, if you're interested in joining sometime, you need to talk to whoever invited you and they can share information on how you continue that process. Big change for us. You'll laugh at this. We're a pretty conservative state. We now allow gave us a chance to raise funds for charitable purposes. That was actually a big thing. It failed about 10 years, finally passed. And our Masonic Home and Grand Lodge Home are now working on creating a joint capital campaign. Probably we're going to try to raise about $160 million to really create a major endowment to both take care of the home and our Grand Lodge building and some of our programs in perpetuity. We have a life membership program, which was revised. We had set the multiplier amount too much. We charged originally, it was 16 times annual dues. We've now moved that to 25, and that's really helping our Grand Lodge. We have about 3,200 deceased members that we're still receiving dues from, and that's a significant amount of income we're getting, as well as hundreds of veteran members who have been 50 years or longer and no longer required to pay dues. So for us, it has been a great benefit. I know there's some Grand Lodges where it's not. Usually I've found it's because they set the number too low. And we have quite a few charities today. One thing that we changed that's kind of interesting just this year with our relief fund is in the past, if you had a member of your lodge who was in need, his house burned down, he got ill, you could apply to Grand Lodge for funding. And what we changed this last year was our district deputies now can give a member on the spot $300 that night. Here's the money, and then apply to Grand Lodge for more. It could be several $1,000s who needs some help. But now our district deputies have the ability to spend $300. So if somebody using that fire situation, if a member needed a hotel room for a night or to buy some food while he's waiting for the insurance to come through and all, they can help them instantly and get additional funding later. So that was a big improvement, I think, for us and where we're going. So that brings us to questions, and I'm going to get off the share screen here, and we'll be glad to take your questions. Real bear with me. Let me get into this. And I'm trying to get off the share here, and for some reason it is not letting me do it. There we go. All right, and brethren, I'll be glad to take any questions you have. I hope I didn't ramble on too long there, and I'll try to fill you in anything I can about Virginia Masonry.
Thank you, Matt. I actually had a question going back to the Grand Lodge of Virginia jewel by Paul Revere. How did the Grand Lodge come by that? Did they order it from Paul Revere? Was it a gift from him?
Very good question. Our records are very thin on it. We have some information. It says it was ordered, but we don't have anything like on a payment being made for it. So we think, and again, this is just the best case guess. We think that they approached him about it, corresponded with him somehow, and said, "Look at," and he made it thinking George Washington was going to be the first Grand Master, which is what we thought at the time. And so I think with George Washington being so prominent, Revere probably thought it would be a wonderful thing to make a jewel for him, but it ended up being John Blair instead. What other
Do we have any questions in the chat?
Yes, we turn to the chat, and
Yep.
Cody Carlo asks, I have seen the death clock, but cannot recall what time he passed.
Oh my, that's good. I'm embarrassed to say I can't either. So, but I will get you an answer on that, and I'll give it to Mike and let you know. I believe it was in the morning. Though I'm pretty confident it was. And you know, you probably all have heard Washington. You know, he had gotten ill. He'd been out riding his horse, developed some kind of fever, and probably the real reason he died was back then they often bled you when you were ill, thinking they would drain the illness out of you, and they bled him for like 2 weeks. And he was extremely weak. And I think that just made the fever get worse and the infection, and that's what killed him. But I will find out the time. I apologize for not knowing that.
I did a quick search. It was 10:20 p.m. on December 14th, 1799.
Thank you.
Cody also commented about the Morgan controversy. He brought up the name of Captain William Morgan.
Yeah, the Morgan affair. Which was, and Morgan was killed. Art de Hoyos, our grand historian, argues, and I hate to say this, the Masons probably did kill him up there. It looks like the evidence does support that. And that was kind of the icing on the cake for the whole anti-Masonic movement. You already had this animosity because of politicians and other things. And then when that happened, people who did not like Freemasonry, of course, it's just like nowadays, it went all over. And back then that would have been newspapers all over, and just really create a major movement against Freemasonry.
We've got a couple of people who are raising their hands, so I'm going to...
Well, if you don't mind, let me answer one too. There's one in here in the chat still about the current relationship of the memorial and the Grand Lodge of Virginia. Let me just address that real quickly. One, if you mean, is it a good or bad one? It is a positive relationship, but actually, in the bylaws of the memorial, we hope it doesn't happen because we'll be stuck with a big bill. If for some reason the board ever failed or could not pay the bills, the building would go to the Grand Lodge of Virginia, and we're responsible for maintaining it. So we hope the board will do a good job. But it is a positive relationship, and we hold many activities there at the memorial, both for subordinate lodges, and the Grand Lodge participates as well. So it's a very good relationship.
John Williamson has raised his hand. John, I'm going to promote you to a panelist. We'll see if we can't get you to allow you to talk. John, you can talk now. There we go. John, you're muted. Turn your mic on.
John, you're muted.
John, turn your mic on, please. There you go. Now your mic's back off, John.
Am I there now?
There.
Hitting the raised hand was a mistake as I moved my mouse. but you did answer the question about the relationship of the Grand Lodge of Virginia and the George Washington National Memorial.
Very good.
Okay.
There is one more in chat I'll answer real quick if that's all right. There was
Go
one
ahead.
about the College of William Mary. There were several members of the lodge who did found Phi Beta Kappa, which was the first fraternity in the United States. And it was started by members of Williamsburg Lodge, and many of the fraternities in the U.S. were, but that one was in particular. And if you go to, I would encourage you, Brother Cody, to go to the Williamsburg Lodge website. And I believe they have some information on there about that, a little more detailed information. If not, Mike can give my email and I'll get you a lot more details. There's a couple of papers that have been given out and I can give you a whole bunch of information. Other
Do we have
questions?
any more questions?
Ron Nielsen has a question.
Okay. Ron, you're allowed to talk.
I appreciate the opportunity, but I don't believe I have a question.
Your hand was up then.
Any other questions I can answer? You guys are being easy. Nothing's off limits.
Micah, time for you to step in.
I got nothing. I wish I had some big controversial question for you, Matt, but I appreciate the history.
Very good. Well, again, I would encourage all of you, if you're ever in Virginia, or if you ever come to House of the Temple, give me a holler, and I will be glad for any of you, if you have the opportunity to help coordinate a visit to any of our historic Masonic sites. If you're out here, just give me a little bit of notice, and I'll be glad to contact the individual lodge. If you're in Richmond and want to see Mason's Hall, or you want to go to the House of the Temple, or if you want to go to Williamsburg Lodge, any of our historic properties, very, very happy. And we do have about probably 40 or 50 Masonic buildings that date from 1790 to 1850 with construction. So a lot of really old historic buildings, and most of which are well maintained. Be glad to arrange that for anybody that comes to Virginia or the Washington, D.C. area.
Deputy Dan?
Oh, I just wanted to let you know that I'm here. And Matt, thank you so much for your presentation. I always enjoy history, and the perspective from the Grand Lodge of Virginia and yourself was really enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with all of you.
Well, since Micah didn't drop in, there he is. I'm going to let him talk, and I'm just going to stand by.
I just want to remind everyone that we will do our fourth Monday presentation on December 27th, and our speaker is going to be Wendy Wassett-Barrett. She has her PhD and is an expert on Masonic scenic drops. So she's going to talk about the evolution of the Scottish Rite from the lodge room to the theater, and is going to talk about our drops in Hastings and Omaha, and hopefully a little bit about the Alliance drops. She's visited both and is extremely knowledgeable, and we're working on a really good lineup for 2022, which will include Freddie Clopton, past Grand Master of Prince Hall, who will talk about Prince Hall Masonry in Nebraska. And if you have good ideas, please let Dan Deffenbaugh, Don Albright, or myself know, and we will get them in the lineup. Matt, thanks again for making time for us, and thank you everyone for joining us on the Lyceum series this month. Wishing everyone a great Christmas, and I know I'll see many of you, but enjoy the holidays, everyone. Dan, Deputy Dan, do you want any last words?
Good night to my brethren. Enjoy and appreciate either seeing your name or seeing your face.
Good. Thank you, Matt, very much.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Good to be with you again.